This video is sponsored by my amazing partners over at the Naval Institute Press, a division of the United States Naval Institute. They've got a special discount for all of you, so be sure to watch until the end of the video to know more.
Do you ever have that moment when you read up on something that you find really interesting, like me with the Skyraider, and then you start going down that rabbit hole and you start discovering more and more stories and more interesting stuff, and suddenly on to something completely different, but you just cannot escape it because you're in the rabbit hole now, you just want to know what's going on? Yeah, that's what happened. Recently, I got this new book, Norman Friedman's US Navy Attack Aircraft, sent to me over by my partners over at the Naval Institute Press. And you see, this is where the trouble began, because they went, "Hey, do you want to talk about that?" And then I went, "Sure, that sounds like a lovely idea," and I immediately flicked it open, went over to those pages that contained the Skyraider information, and that led me over to the Skyraiders in Vietnam, then Counter-Insurgency, and suddenly I was going through DoD defense procurement. Yeah, it was another day at the office.
Counter-insurgency, or COIN, was a major component in air operations in the last decade and a half, with the deployments to Iraq, Afghanistan and elsewhere. For aircraft, we saw a lot of different systems being used, from A-10s, RPAs, over to light attack aircraft. As Western countries now withdraw from such scenarios as much as possible, and another war erupted in Europe, the decade of Western-style aerial counter-insurgency appears at an end. And that got me thinking, because it feels familiar. Old ideas resurface time and time again, or rather, all of this happened before, and all of this will happen again. Well, sort of. I went down the rabbit hole to figure out how aerial COIN operations got started. But before I start to talk about where COIN comes from, let me just briefly explain what I mean by it. While aerial COIN operations have received a reputation of being all about dropping munitions, that is just one element. COIN, in the aviation sense, can be broadly summed up as ISR, so intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance, strike, so using munitions to engage a target, operating outside of traditional front lines, combat search and rescue, as well as airlift. For now, the type of aircraft is pretty much inconsequential. It could be an RPA, a turboprop, a helicopter, or a jet. I recognize, of course, there is give and take between these platforms and the sort of equipment they carry, but for clarity I bracket off those details for now. While we can argue about the exact historical chronology, we can trace the concept broadly back all the way into the pre-World War I period, for example with the Italian use of aviation in Libya, and then for sure into the interwar period, where colonial powers would use aircraft to patrol territories, replacing or freeing up work from larger territorial ground units. Aircraft could be armed, covered ground very quickly, relayed information in a matter of hours, and insurgents usually lacked the firepower to take them on. The old saying, "whatever happens, we've got the Maxim and they have not," takes another ring to it once you actually load that weapon onto an aircraft. During World War II, fighter bombers of course emerged among most countries, with close air support becoming ever more important. And the fighting there was of course based on clear front lines, but there are a few examples similar to COIN. For example, the Luftwaffe used Ju-87 Stukas in anti-partisan operations, or in the Pacific, Allied aircraft flew against pockets of Japanese soldiers or would use commando drops in order to impede Japanese movements. But these examples were very small in scale. And following the war, a conventional and a nuclear standoff between the West and the Soviet Union was considered the most obvious threat, and thus it received the most attention. You can check out this video for more information on that. Of course, with the emergence of the limited war, well, Western air forces needed something more flexible. And in Korea, although it was largely a conventional war, we already have some of those examples. But Vietnam was different, completely different. From the basing, the terrain, the geography, the weather, even treaty agreements, everything was different. And that ultimately led to the rise of the COIN program, and with it, the COIN aircraft. The French did something like this in the late 1940s and early 1950s in what they called French Indochina at the time. Other European countries would do similar in their colonies over the years, but from a development, technical, tactical, strategic and production standpoint, amongst basically all major powers, counterinsurgency was really not a focus. By the way, if you're French, or not French, but you know some good sources on the French development and use of, well, essentially coin aviation during the Cold War period, including also development and production programs that happened at this point in time, please send that info to me. It can be in French, that would be really cool to read. S'il vous plaît, ce serait très intéressant.
By the early 1960s, the aircraft that were already carrying out this work were approaching the end of their life cycles. Some of them got modernization programs and were re-winged, for example. But basically the T-28s and the B-26s that the US had sent over to Vietnam, well, there were a lot of reports that, you know, those airframes were really starting to struggle. So something new, an alternative, was needed. And this is what the showbiz calls a narrative cliffhanger, although I just call it a waste of time. Let's get into it.
In 1961, a dedicated step towards the development of an aircraft solely for the purposes of a limited war was made. A new program was launched, and it had that new acronym, COIN. It was vague, like really vague, as no one really knew where the road was leading to. Or in the words of one publication, there is no firm COIN doctrine and no final definition of COIN requirements. Initially, there was also overall agreement that so-called COIN wars could not be won by air power and air power alone, but they would be lost without air power. So based on this initiative, then the COIN program was drawn up, and it broke down COIN aviation as a multifaceted role. And it involved several tasks, from cargo runs over to day and nighttime close air support, the fast deployment of ground forces and the support of airborne operation, then reconnaissance of course, and flare drops during night operations, and then finally interdiction with attacks carried out on bottlenecks, enemy retreats, supply, and of course the enemy's morale. Preferably a single plane was supposed to do all these things. And the specification of this plane summed up were that they had to be easy to fly and easy to maintain, that they would have to be able to take off from short, unprepared runways, not necessarily a full stall plane, but going into that direction, that they should be cheap to build and to operate, and that they should have a crew of 2 and be driven by a propeller. Propeller aircraft, whether piston or turboprop, in themselves have contextual advantages over jet aircraft. There's a lot here to unpack, so I'm just going to focus on a few key points here. So they have a lower fuel consumption, leading generally to cheaper operations and longer loiter time. They also have easier requirements when it comes to basing and maintenance. And then of course there's also a discussion that can be had about the vulnerability of these systems, but that is an extremely complex subject with very strong context dependency here. So I will bracket it off for now. In any case, these aircraft tend to be a better match for COIN than jet aircraft, since they also operate at lower altitudes and speeds. But in Vietnam, it should also not be forgotten that the requirements for propeller-driven aircraft also had legal reasons. When supporting South Vietnam prior to 1964, when it came to air support, there were some restrictions. Initially, it was a mixed bag of flying sorties only on the express wishes of the South Vietnamese, who had to request these strikes. And even then there was a requirement for a South Vietnamese observer to be on board. So the way this would generally play out is South Vietnam would request a strike, the Americans would check whether that strike can be carried out, and if the South Vietnamese cannot do it themselves, then they would send off 1 or 2 or multiple aircraft with American aircraft with an American pilot on its way. These aircraft would land at a certain base, pick up a South Vietnamese observer who would then from then on just be along for the ride. They would fly off to the mission zone, drop their munitions, fly back, drop off the South Vietnamese passenger, and then fly back to the original base. And then of course there was also that restrictions to what sort of aircraft could be imported. And all of this was subject to the treaty restrictions of 1954.
And that came in the shape of the 1954 Geneva Conference. Now, I'm no legal expert by any description of the word. However, it does appear like this agreement, this treaty, or whatever they put to paper back then, had more holes in it than a shooting range in Texas. But it made one thing very clear, and America, for the time being, was happy to roll with it. And that is that jet aircraft were forbidden from being imported into Vietnam based on Chapter 3, Article 17. Of course, that didn't stop anybody from, basing jets in neighboring countries, but I guess that's another story. But Are you going to ignore the Gulf of Tonkin incident 1964?
Not there yet. In late 1962, the COIN program officially launched with the express aim to find replacements for the aging T-28 and B-26s. That replacement would become the OV-10 Bronco, although of course a slew of development and conversions were carried out in parallel or followed in its wake. The program was extensive. First of all, special units were set up or reactivated to test COIN, not just aircraft, but everything that goes into these operations. So they looked at radio communications and homing navigation within the mountainous and tropical conditions of Southeast Asia. They took, for example, inspiration there from the British low frequencies Decca system. They worked on ordnance and ammunition to use in the dense foliage of the terrain. So generic rockets and bombs were really ineffective due to mud, rice paddies and foliage that would either set off the fuses too late or too early, and so on. They even looked into some ground-based stuff, like trying to figure out if advanced warning of approaching enemy forces by using seismic detectors. And then they looked into airlift solutions, and who can forget amongst that portfolio was also an attempt or an experiment on how to best transport a cow in a helicopter.
Okay, so I understand that you have questions now, so I'll make this very quick. Basically, they put a cow into the loading bay of an H-34, and the cow panicked at 1,000 feet, jumped out and met its end, I assume, in a very violent cow-ground interface. So yeah, take this as your proof that systems are neither soldier nor bovine proof. They used nets after that. It's a learning experience, I guess.
The American program also coincides or partially inspired other nations to do something similar. Although initially not that much comes out of it, and most of these programs ended in failure or, well, they were mainly aborted. That's a big can of worms that I don't have time for now, and in any case, the exact chronology and influence is not always clear.
During this time, there were of course very intense debates about whether a cheap alternative to the now dominant jet aircraft was a viable solution for a range of tasks or a very specialized role like the COIN aircraft. And of course, this period in time also has a lot of inter-service rivalry, but also cooperation between the Navy, the Marine Corps, and then of course also the Air Force. For example, the Air Force was looking into up-arming light private aircraft like Cessnas with rockets and guns and bombs, and see if that's not a viable platform for a COIN aircraft. The Navy and the Marine Corps, of course, were championing more the COIN aircraft that was coming out of this program, so that would eventually then also of course be the Bronco. And there were even calls for a renewed production run of the Skyraider, although that did not materialize. Now, if you want to have a great overview of this time and essentially a centenary of aircraft development for the US Navy, I can heartily recommend Norman Friedman's book here, US Navy Aircraft, Attack Aircraft. Now, I know what you're going to say. Did I just make this switcheroo to launch this into an ad segment? Well, yes, I did, but that's for two reasons. First of all, this book is to blame for putting me on this merry goose chase. And secondly, I do think my partners at the Naval Institute Press deserve the attention because they have an absolute fantastic range of books that come with, of course, a fantastic 25%, let me say that again, 25% discount code. They're an exceptionally good source for literature on aviation and naval topics. Remember, you can get that 25% discount on their full book range with my exclusive discount code. And yes, that also includes Friedman's book. So let's talk about this book because it's a really cool thing to have or to give somebody. I mean, Christmas is pretty much around the corner by now. And yeah, so basically what it tracks is a centenary of US naval aircraft or US Navy naval aircraft. There we go. And of course, with that scope, every aircraft has sort of a summary. So it's not a technical book in the traditional sense where you get all the details about one single book. No, you get track the development of the whole essentially force from 1920 over to 2020. And that, of course, gives you a rundown of the history. You start seeing those shifts in aviation design, the thinking behind it, and you also see commonalities between those times and just changes in technology and changes in capability. And it's just a fantastic source to have really as a mantelpiece, almost as a mantelpiece, you could say, really. I mean, it is a dominant force in your bookshelf. I can tell you that for a fact. I mean, this really is an imposing tome of knowledge. So do check it out. And of course, may also make sure to check out my reading list on the Naval Institute Press website. You'll see more recommendations there. But remember that 25% discount code goes for their whole range. And if you want to go as far as becoming a member of the Naval Institute Press, you can also get a even better discount with 40% on the whole book range. So do consider that as well if you're an avid reader.
Get on with it.
Yes, 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 of course. Okay, so now that the COIN program and the COIN aircraft, the procurement was launched, how come that jet aviation became so important over Vietnam? Well, I can't really go into the whole specifics of the escalation that happened back then because, you know, it's a topic that books have been written on, so I can't talk about the why, the how, and the when, except bringing it back to a simplified point of, well, the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, whereupon the gloves formally came off.
With the incident, the initial restrictions for air support and equipment seemed to go out of the window, and with it, much of the support for the COIN initiative as well. Although a lot went into the initiative, I will focus here on the OV-10 Bronco procurement and bracket off everything else, since it was the plane that stood at the heart of the COIN program. I will add that this appears to be one of the more drastic, although unknown reversals. Well, reversals in fortune is maybe pushing it a bit, but there was a clear priority on this program for some time, and then with the Gulf of Tonkin incident, especially for the Bronco, things suddenly looked very, very hazy once again. So if you compare that to any other Cold War plane procurement out there, of course there are many reversals, but this one for a plane that was pushed as a priority and then suddenly was no longer a priority is quite a standout, especially in the sense that it's not all that well known. And I spent a lot of time trying to retrace the steps here to figure out what exactly happened, but there are still some open questions that remain. So the chronology that I'm showing you now, I have a fair degree of confidence in it, but there, like I said, there are still some open questions for myself there as well. So between 1961 and 1964, COIN aircraft were considered a top priority to the point where they even pushed back other programs. By May 1964, the COIN competition was in its final stretch, with Vietnam also receiving A-1 Skyraiders to replace T-28s and V-26s as an interim solution. And then of course came that Gulf of Tonkin incident, and by December 1964, the whole idea of a COIN aircraft had lost traction. It's like it drops off the radar for some time. Instead of the Bronco, planes like the Northrop F-5 are being pushed forward as a potential solution, with a 1965 evaluation between it and the A4, the A6, the A7 and the F4 meant to produce a recommendation for future tactical air support, a task that was argued to overlap with COIN. The F-5 was also then sent to Vietnam as part of a general test of the platform, and by August 1965, the OV-10 Bronco wasn't even considered anymore as a type that was really required in quantity. And although it was eventually built and deployed in Vietnam, the program hung in the balance for quite some time with that sudden shift in priorities. As the war escalated and the air campaign was in full swing, a COIN aircraft was no longer considered necessary. Instead, the dominant opinion became that a mixed force of bombers and fast jets would be much better equipped to handle all the tasks required in Vietnam, and then of course that growing significance of rotary aviation in combat operations must have also reduced the interest in a COIN platform, as again overlaps appeared. In short, the COIN aircraft was recognized as a specialized solution perfect for a limited war, but Vietnam wasn't really limited anymore and would be decided elsewhere and with different means. Which of course, if I bring all of this into the 21st century, brings me back to these bad boys, but that's for another video. Oh, don't forget to remind everyone of that 25% discount code for the whole Naval Institute Press's book collection. And don't forget to thank your patrons and channel members for being awesome people, for, you know, funding this content and making it possible. And tell everybody to have a great day, and that you will see them in the sky. They know.